Okay, thanks, Greg. So my name's Tom Davison. I work with Meat and Livestock Australia in the Brisbane office, and my role is around manager of sustainable feed base, which includes historically we've been looking after a major research program looking at the opportunities, productivity opportunities around reducing methane emissions from cattle and sheep, and the interface with that is how that might allow producers to have access to alternative sources of income through what is called the Emissions Reduction Fund. So the Emissions Reduction Fund is a federal government scheme that allows people through projects to access funds that will be part of a contract to reduce their emissions. It's really quite a complicated policy space, but what we've been trying to do is work out, well, given that policy and these arrangements, what are the opportunities for red meat producers? So the Department of Environment asked us to conduct a study, desktop study with some major cattle producers in Northern Australia looking at what could be done. And the reason we work with them is because they had ready access to a bunch of records which are needed for this. And secondly, we've been working with them. And the idea was that we would work with these three large cattle companies, namely Consolidated Pastoral, AACO, and the Indigenous Land Corporation. We presented them with confidential reports about what they could do for their own organisations, and today we've been able to take the results from those individual studies back into generic results that could apply to the rest of the industry. So the results, what we're talking about today, substantively apply to cattle properties and substantively to Northern Australia, although there's lots that we can talk about in terms of relevance to Southern Australia as well, if people wish. So the idea was to do these detailed case studies looking at what are the opportunities. So if I go through some of the notes here on my screen, the ERF is a carbon offset scheme that the government rewards farmers, landholders and other sectors of the economy where they can take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and can show that. And we're able to do that under a number of activities which I'll go through in a minute. So this report investigates the opportunities available to Australian pastoral companies who may participate in the ERF. So as I said, we engaged three major companies. We looked at assessing a range of opportunities for some of the properties within those companies' portfolios, and then we're trying to today demonstrate how these results might apply generically across the industry. So we're going to use words like methods. So a method is a process, an agreed procedure that the government has approved, which sets out a practice. And a practice might be growing your animals faster, using a new supplement, bringing in a new forage, improved reproductive performance, for example. A second area might be using nitrate supplements in lieu of urea supplements in North Australia. A third one might be savanna fire management, where you go from wildfire burns late in the dry season to controlled burning earlier in the dry season, and so reduce your overall greenhouse gas emissions. And a fourth and fifth way is what we call methods, looking at sequestering carbon through plantings or avoided clearing or managing regrowth. So they were the main 4 or 5 methods that we applied to a subset of properties in Northern Australia, and then we have then, through the work of Steve and Phil, attempted to apply these results generically, and that's what Steve and Phil will be going through with you. So first of all, let me introduce Phil. Phil Cone is the Carbon Market Advisor from Victoria. He's been working with us in the National Livestock Methane Program and identifying opportunities from our research that may be taken into methods that then would allow potentially allow producers to access the ERF scheme. And Steve Wiedemann has had a lot of experience working in the cattle industry with FSA Consulting, both in the intensive industry and in the grass-fed industry. So I just want to say that this is an opportunities study that we've undertaken, but anyone who is interested in investigating this further has to look at their own data and their own properties and their own situation. And so what we're giving you today are indicative results of what's possible. as well as Phil explaining exactly how to interact with the ERF scheme. So back to you, Greg, or over to Phil.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So, yeah, as Tom said, my name's Phil Conn. I've been working alongside Tom and Steve to put together this study into ERF opportunities in Northern Australia. As we touched on earlier, so I'm just having a little trouble with my screen here. This presentation will have 3 parts. Part 1, which I'll go through now, is just a bit more of an overview of the ERF and some of the results that have been achieved to date broadly across the industry. In the second part, Steve Wiedemann will do a deep dive into opportunities to, I guess, reduce emissions within cattle herds using a new herd management method that's being developed under the ERF. And then I'll come back again for the final part of the presentation to just look at some of the economics, some of the results that we've found as part of the STAR interested or maybe interested in participating in the ERF, where they could go to sell their carbon. So, first things first, the Emissions Reduction Fund. So as Tom's just said, the Emissions Reduction Fund, it's the government's, I guess, primary policy for reducing emissions, so in order that we achieve our internationally agreed targets of a 5% reduction below 2000 levels by 2020. We'll be, we do that by providing a financial incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if you create an emissions reduction fund project and you can demonstrate to the government that you have reduced emissions, you will create a carbon credit, or an ACCU, so Australian Carbon Credit Unit. And each one of these units represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that's reduced or sequestered in vegetation. So that carbon credit becomes the mechanism, so by selling that, that's giving you the financial return on reducing emissions. Now, the diagram that you see at the bottom of this slide was there's 4 steps to participate in the Emissions Reduction Fund. Looks very straightforward. Unfortunately, within each of those steps, there's a little bit of complexity involved, but we'll tease out some of that complexity today, and then obviously refer anyone who's interested onto other sources of information, including the major report that will be released as a result of the study that Steve and I and others have completed. So critical first step is obviously to apply to register your project. If you go ahead and implement your new emissions reduction project without first registering it with the government, you will be ineligible to create carbon credits. So it's really critical that you apply and you register your project, and there's a bunch of forms and paperwork you need to fill out in order to do that. You then have the option of participating in an auction, and these auctions are run by the government, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. Once you've implemented your project, there's a requirement to continue to monitor and collect data and report back to government on what you've done, and periodically have those reports audited. And if everything's hunky-dory and those reports get signed off, the government will issue you with your carbon credits, with your ACCUs, and then you can go on and deliver those under a contract that you may hold and receive payment for those carbon credits. That's a very, very just quick snapshot of how the ERF works. So register for your projects, implement, decide how you want to sell your credits, and get a contract if that's what you decide to do. Ongoing monitoring and reporting and some verification, delivery of your carbon credits, and subsequent payment on delivery. This next slide that I've just put up on the screen is really, I guess, looking historically about what's been achieved in carbon markets in Australia, because as many of you would be aware, it's been a hotly contested policy space. And before we had the Emissions Reduction Fund, or the ERF, we had the Carbon Farming Initiative. Essentially, very similar schemes. Everything that was achieved under the CFI and the methodologies that were created have been rolled into, in one form or another, into the ERF, and effectively the ERF is a broader economy-wide version of the CFI, the Carbon Farming Initiative. Many of you would have heard a bit about the CFI, so I thought it'd be worthwhile just to sort of paint the picture of, can northern cattle producers make money out of the ERF? Well, certainly some made money out of the Carbon Farming Initiative. The numbers you see up on your screen at the moment are the number of carbon credits that were issued to different methods or different project types up until the start of February this year, which was effectively the the end date of the previous government's carbon pricing mechanism. So we had 200 projects that were registered across these different areas, and we had about 14.5 million carbon credits that were issued. Now, a large chunk of those projects involved sequestration, carbon sequestration in vegetation, and also savanna fire management in Northern Australia. And if you have a look at those project types and take out the landfill gas management, which isn't relevant to landholders, you've got nearly 7 million carbon credits that were generated up until the start of February, and those were valued under the previous scheme at around about $20. So already, in terms of carbon markets in Australia, you've seen over $130 million going to landowners. Now, not all of those will be cattle producers, but a large proportion of them will be. And it's terrific to see that those early adopters and early movers have taken advantage of the CFI, and we're seeing more and more take-up under the ERF. Going on to the next slide, moving out of the carbon farming initiative, where it was companies that were buying carbon credits as part of their compliance under the previous government's policy, what we have in the ERF is the government itself buying your carbon credits, and they do that via an auction mechanism. Once you've registered your project, you can make a decision about participating in an auction. And you do that. In order to participate, you have to register, and you nominate to the government to say, these are my delivery terms, this is how many carbon credits I'm going to supply, this is over what time period, and what sort of project am I going to be doing. So you specify all of that, and there's some options there in terms of the types of contract that you might want to enter into. When it comes to the day of the auction, you nominate the dollar price for your carbon credits, for your ACCUs. So it's a single bid, and it's sealed, so no one else can see what you've bid, and no one else will find out whether or not what price you were paid if you were successful in getting a contract. And those contracts are awarded by the government on one criterion, and that's price. So if you've got 100 projects turning up at an auction, each with a different price, the government will buy from cheapest all the way up to what they call their benchmark price, which is the highest price they're prepared to pay, and they will buy 80% of the carbon credits that are offered underneath that benchmark price. And that's how those auctions work. So far, we've only had one auction, but it was actually a really significant result. At that auction, you had 144 projects that received a contract, which representing over 47 million tonnes of emissions reductions that will be delivered over the next 7 to 10 years. And the average price that was paid was $13.95. And so at that very first auction, the government, which has set aside $2.55 billion to be buying these carbon credits, they committed $660 million to buy carbon credits. So it's a significant market. The government is deploying significant amount of capital to incentivise emission reductions across the economy, and you're seeing 144 projects take up that opportunity at the first auction, which was back in April. Now, in terms of what projects benefited from that, again, as it was under the carbon farming initiative, it was dominated at this stage by sort of forest and soil sequestration projects. So 60% of the carbon credits to be delivered under these contracts that were signed at the first auction will come from those project types. About another 40%, or 38% from landfill and waste management, and then a small number of other credits. So really a big nod to landfill waste management, but particularly sequestration and soil carbon. And when you think about that in terms of what does that mean for livestock producers, livestock producers are benefiting from the ERF at the moment through these sequestration projects. So we had avoided deforestation projects, most of which are located on grazing properties in central and western New South Wales. We had 5 contracts awarded for increasing soil carbon in grazing systems. We had 17 contracts awarded at the auction for native forest regeneration and some tree planting projects, and some of those we expect to be on grazing properties. So doing a few back-of-the-envelope sums, we estimate, and again we can't be 100% certain, but broadly speaking, we think about 50% of the value or dollars committed at that first auction will go to livestock producers. So that's another $330 million over the next 7 to 10 years that will be delivered to producers, and that's on top of that $140 million that we already saw under the CFI. So it's a new scheme, it's highly contested from a policy perspective, but there are some real benefits that we're seeing already flowing through to livestock producers. As I said before, most of those results are being achieved through the carbon sequestration projects. And what's a really new area is looking at, can we deal with the methane that's coming out of livestock systems? And so what's really exciting is that we're seeing a growing number of new methodologies, and Tom touched on these methodologies earlier. These are sort of the recipes you've got to follow to do particular types of emission reduction activities. And back in February 2013, we had a limited number of methods that were applicable to landowners and livestock producers. And come the middle of this year, we've got some more methodologies that are coming online, and plus a pipeline of new methods that are being developed to increase the scope of opportunities for participation by livestock producers. Now you can see there in this table, there's one method in particular, hold herd management, which we've been working on for a number of years, which MLA has been supporting, and Steve Wiedemann in the next section will spend a lot of time talking about what the results of our analysis look like when you apply that whole herd management method on a range of farms and scenarios in Northern Australia, because then we're starting to look beyond, I guess, vegetation management and sequestration opportunities into what might also be the emission reduction opportunities within your own herds from improving the efficiency of your production. So I know that's been a very rapid fire I guess run through of the ERF and how it works and some of the results that have been achieved to date, but I'll finish there and I guess throw it open to some questions, Greg, if people have any.
Okay, yes, Phil, thank you very much for that and good presentation. We do have a couple of questions. One of the questions coming in is, rather than native forests, I just got to expand this out a bit. Rather than native forest regeneration planting, can the planting of tropical grasses as forage or feed for livestock be eligible for approval under ERF?
So with the sequestration methods, there is what's called a permanence requirement. So that carbon needs to be sequestered and permanently stored for at least 25 years. There's an option to choose 25 years or 100 years. So if you're planting out a forage crop that's, say, consumed on an annual basis, there's not that permanent sequestration of carbon in that vegetation. Now, where there may be some opportunities is rather than in sort of a vegetation type sequestration methods, as if you're putting in forage crops that can demonstrably increase soil carbon levels, and that might occur if you're planting some legume forage crops. And certainly there's some research being done at the moment and previously on leukemia growing and its impact on soil carbon, which is still quite positive. It might be that rather than the carbon being stored in the plants themselves, it's in fact stored in the soils. So there may be an opportunity there, but certainly if it's, there is that permanence requirement with sequestration projects that producers should consider.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got time for one more quick question before we move on. Next question is, if you are participating in a contracted avoided deforestation project and the trees don't grow quick enough to deliver the contracted units at 10 years, can the project manager purchase units from another source, e.g. for the like of a piggery or a reforestation project?
That's a terrific question, and I'm going to get into that in my, I guess, part 3, but I would just to briefly answer say yes. If you have less credits coming out of your project than you'd hoped or anticipated and have contracted, there is the flexibility to deliver credits from any other project that's out there. So there is the volume of credits under your contract is fixed, but the source isn't. So you have that flexibility built in to turn around to your neighbour or to a piggery or to someone doing an energy efficiency project and say, if you've got some spare carbon credits, I need them, I'll buy them from you and I'll use those to deliver on my contract with the government and be paid for those credits that are delivered.
Okay. Just conscious of time, so I will just pass over to Steve. And if you could just bring up your presentation, Steve, that'd be great, because we just can't seem to see it at this stage. just show your screen there, and we should be able to.
Yep. Sorry, I brought it up, but
yeah, I can see that at this end. Greg,
okay.
so hopefully others can.
All right. They should be able to. Yes. Okay, go for your life.
Great, no worries. Righto. Well, I'll just follow on from Phil and explain how you can apply one of these methods that's just about due for release in another month or so for claiming carbon credits from cattle herds. So, just work out. Sorry, I'm having a. There we go. So this method works by avoiding emissions from cattle herds. So that functions by reducing the emissions intensity of the herd compared to the 3 years immediately prior to you starting the project. So you're comparing or improving against your own previous production. So to apply to the method, you have to change some practices on farm, and I'll explain what that means to achieve the improvements. So just to kind of explain what the whole emissions intensity story is about, this is about the kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of beef, and that's governed by herd feed efficiency. So basically improving herd productivity is what will improve herd feed efficiency, and that will reduce emissions intensity and increase beef production per cow. So I guess the crux of this is you know a lot more about this than you may previously have thought. There's a whole lot of ways you can do that. Fewer unproductive animals by higher weaning rates, younger joining age, so you're producing more calves per cow in her lifetime. So if I just whack some diagrams in there, you got at different stages of the production system for backgrounding cattle and growing right through to finishing weights, improving average daily gain, reducing turn-off age at the same weight. That's the sort of thing. And just to make it clear, feedlots have been excluded from this method. So the kind of practices you can undertake, you need to be able to show that they're going to reduce emissions intensity, so improve weaning rate or average daily gain, for example. They have to be new, which means that they weren't done in the 7 years before starting the project, or they have to be different to practices that you've done to date. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity around that variation in practice. If you sit down and think about it, there's always stuff being changed in terms of improving production. So I think there's opportunities to apply under that. Practices that can't be used, feeding non-protein nitrogen, so urea. That's there's another method that covers that around nitrate feeding, so that's excluded out of this. Just shifting cattle to a new block of land, that's ineligible. Feedlot finishing, as mentioned, and you can't go out and clear a whole lot of land to increase herd or improve herd performance, because you'd be producing emissions on one hand and claiming credits for reducing them on the other. So you have to implement at least one practice each year that complies with this. So the kind of practices that you can implement, I guess it's really all driven by improving feed quality. That's how you're going to increase productivity out of the herd. Phytocrops, paddock feeding of grain, pasture improvement, more water points, fencing, reduced stocking rates. So basically the options are wide open. Feed supplements, and anything that will allow you to improve herd management. So if improved fencing allows you to segregate particular classes of cattle and supplementary feed them, then all of that's an option that's eligible. And you can combine any number of ways to achieve it. So it's pretty flexible sort of approach. So here's a couple of case studies that we've been working on. We've got a 10,000 head breeder herd, Stelling steers at 2 years, 315 kilos, so Livestock driven system. current productivity, 55% weaning rate, 5% mortality rate, and the emissions intensity around that 17 to 19 kilograms CO2 per kilogram of live weight. So what they're aiming to do is basically a development program with fencing and additional water points. Aim there is to allow herd segregation and reduce overgrazing, etc. Hopefully improve condition scores and pregnancy rates. Along with that herd segregation, targeted supplementation, particularly around second calving heifers, to try and up those weaning rates. And they're also looking at an irrigation or fodder cropping type arrangement to improve the growth rate for young cattle. So that's probably a higher input type program there. And along with all that, increasing selection pressure in the breeding herd, culling productive breeders, reducing breeder numbers a little bit to feed the cattle that are actually producing. So if you look at the how the numbers stack up there, you've got the pre-project period, about a bit over 1,500, nearly 1,600 tonnes of live weight produced from that herd each year. Actually, the next couple of scenarios with lower breeder numbers but higher weaning rates are producing more beef at lower emissions intensity. So the revenue from carbon's coming in 40,000 in the first and close to 60,000 in the second scenario. So look, obviously the big profit driver in a change like that, it's going to cost a lot of money, and the big profit driver is going to be from increased beef turn-off. The carbon's going to be, or the revenue from carbon is going to be a little bit of an addition on top of that, and it might tip some projects over the line and by making them a little bit more profitable. Our numbers come out somewhere around 6 to 10% additional revenue from carbon. So we're not going to change the world, but we might take an idea through to reality just by adding a little bit more revenue to the system. So if we look at another scenario, this is in the VRD, we've got 15,000 breeders, this time producing weaner steers at turn off at 6 months. Similar-ish sort of stats on this herd, a little bit lower emissions intensity, and they're looking to move to a rotational grazing type system. Again, herd segregation with better fencing, with targeted supplementation, etc., and increased selection pressure on the breeding herd. So if we look at these numbers, we see again increased beef production from the herd, from the higher weaning rates, higher cull cow turn off, and in the last scenario, a little increase in the weaning weight of steers as well, up to 195 kilos. So it's driving the emissions intensity down, and you see the kind of returns you can get out of applying that sort of change. So if we wrap that up, this method's due for approval in the next couple of months. Best opportunities in our study is focused on northern herds, but I realise most cattle herds aren't that big, and a lot of people on the line will be from smaller operations than that. So the opportunities for those people are really going to come in with aggregation of credits across multiple herds, and people setting themselves up as aggregators, whether that's processors or livestock agents, or there's multiple opportunities to do that, and that'll allow much broader participation. And the biggest opportunity is going to be where performance is actually lowest at the moment, and that's from a herd point of view, but it's also, I guess, you know, how you're going to compare with district averages. If you're right at the top of the tree, there's going to be quite possibly less opportunity to improve. If you happen to be one of the people who've got 90% weaning rates already, just the genetic potential probably isn't there to go a lot higher than that. But generally around growth rates, if you can look right up to you know, 1.7, 1.8 kilograms a day for cattle on grain, so there's a lot of room to move there compared to, say, an average 600 kilo turn-off steer at 3 years. which would be coming in around that 0.4 or lower kilograms of gain per day. So there's a lot of opportunity around improving those gain rates, and depends also on what sort of land you're on and where you're at in the sort of improvement, property improvement type scale. We'd probably look at it and say, you need certainly good records around livestock numbers and weights and so on to carry this kind of project forward. And it's going to be most attractive where you've already got a plan and you're hoping to implement it over a number of forward years, maybe for property development or something like that, and you can see and expect that you'll get herd productivity improvements. This would be a situation where you can come in and bring another revenue stream alongside that to assist in that whole program. That's probably it from me.
Okay.
Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Steve. And yes, there's plenty of questions coming in, and thank you for that short presentation. Well done. Okay, there are a number of questions starting to come in now. One of them is, why is feedlotting excluded from the ERF?
It's really a matter of drawing lines somewhere, so that was going to add a lot of complexity. It's not a, it doesn't reflect like a policy decision. It reflects trying to get a method that's usable developed, and I think that following that, there's a really good case for developing a method around feedlotting. Certainly the modelling we've done and published in recent times has shown 17 to 20% reduction in emissions from grain finishing. So the opportunity is there. This method, it'll allow you to paddock feed, but not put them in a feedlot. And I think anyway, that's the decision that the government's made, I suppose.
Okay. Not a problem. Is there any research on sequestering carbon in soil? For example, best methods and what is achievable?
Yeah, look, I don't know if Phil or Tom, if you comment on this one. My focus has been on the herd method side of things. I know there's a stackload of work in this area. I know a lot of the problems.
Steve, I can help you there if you like.
Around quantification. Yeah, fire away, Tom.
Oh yeah, Greg. Look, MLA has engaged in a lot of research in the opportunities under soil carbon. Ram Dalal from the Queensland government has just been running a major soil carbon research program, courtesy of the federal government, filling the research gap, and across a whole bunch of areas. There is some prospectivity in where, number one, where there's significant tree planting happening, and number two, in some cases with some legumes. But we have had trouble identifying many other opportunities, but perhaps that's the subject for another webinar, Greg, because we're just focused on the animal methane side here today. But yes, other work has been.
Okay, not a problem. One quick final question for this section or this segment, Steve. Does the carbon income presented remove carbon project and verification costs? And if not, what is that likely to cost?
Yeah, great question. Phil's going to cover it in just a few minutes.
Okay,
so stay tuned.
Okay, all right.
I think, Greg, too, Tom here, there were a number of other methods looked at. Phil might be able to cover them off briefly, but the herd management one, which Steve went through, number one, it hasn't been approved yet. We're hoping it will be approved soon, so it's making people aware of the opportunities. But the other methods, three of them were in areas like savanna burning management, avoided deforestation, and native forest managed regrowth. So Phil might be able to touch on those briefly, or people can ask questions about them if they wish.
Absolutely. So over to you, Phil. If you would like to continue, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Greg. Well, I can hopefully, as Steve just said, hopefully answer the last question about what does it cost to get involved. And so part of this study that we did, we wanted to get a feel for, okay, we understand the carbon credit generation side a little bit more now. we know how the first auction went under the ERF, but what does it cost to get involved? And so here's a breakdown of some of the estimated costs. And again, these are our estimates based on our own understanding of developing these projects in the market and also discussing them with other project owners and auditors. So what we estimated that to get a project registered and up and running, there might be some technical work that needs to be done up front that may need some specialist input, so we've estimated a $10,000 cost up front there. For the ongoing monitoring and record keeping, we thought an estimate of $3,500 per project per year, and every time you produce a report, you need to pull that data together and compile a report. We thought $5,000 a year. Now, sorry, $5,000 per report. These are just estimates, and it will completely depend on your own setup. You might have all the in-house capabilities to do everything you need with these projects, and you can absorb those costs. You may need or decide to completely outsource it. So we just put in some estimates there. With the audit costs, we went and spoke to a few of the audit companies out there that are certified to audit ERF projects, and we got some quotes for them based on the different methodologies, and you can see the costs that have come in there in terms of a higher fee for the initial audit with a project and then ongoing audit fees. And for most of the scenarios that we looked at, there was I guess a requirement for the project to have at least 3 audits across their crediting periods. So then if you look at the total carbon expenses, so that is those project development costs and the audit costs, for those cattle methodologies, so that's the herd management and also nitrates methods that Steve's referred to, across the 7 years, those costs total up around $100,000. For the, I guess, the vegetation, avoided clearing and managed regrowth methods, we estimated about $150,000 over 25 years. They have a much longer crediting period. That's the time period for which you can claim credits for. And savanna fire management was around about $200,000 over the same period. So that gives people a sense of, I guess, the cost side for getting involved. And the next couple of slides are a little bit busy, so I apologise, but they are really going to show people, I guess, the combination of those revenue and cost sides. So going back, I guess, each of these tables covers off a methodology that was looked at and some of the scenarios that we reported on. There's further scenarios that we're providing in the reports. I've just grabbed a few out really to show, I guess, the variation between different scenarios so that people can get a sense of, what might be the range of experiences depending on what activities you're implementing, which methods you're using, and the nature of your current management or baseline activities. So you're looking back at the herd management method, which was the 2 scenarios that Steve put up. He presented the annual emission reductions, or ACCUs. I've just grabbed the full 7 years, the total revenue, assuming that these guys got a $13.95 carbon price, and the total expenses over the 7-year crediting period. And so you can see, depending on the scenario, you're looking at, say, $200,000 to $500,000 in net income under those scenarios that we looked at for the herd management method. So not insignificant, but as Steve said, the real driver is going to be that productivity gain that you're going to get by implementing these project activities. And so this is effectively the cream on top that can hopefully push some of those activities and new management plans, make them viable if they otherwise wouldn't have been. The nitrates method, much lower emission reduction potential there by substituting nitrates for urea. You can see there that even with a very large aggregation of 30,000 breeders, we got less than 10,000 carbon credits, and once you net off the revenue and expenses, you're looking at around about 30,000 after 7 years, so a relatively marginal activity there. The next 2 tables there, the avoided clearing and native forestry managed regrowth, I've picked out these 2 scenarios because they really show the importance of understanding the methodology that you're applying and the baseline. So effectively the emission reduction potential. So if you've got very high emissions in your baseline, there's a lot of potential to reduce it. If you've got good land management activities going on, or depending on your particular circumstance or level of rainfall, there may be less opportunity to sequester carbon. So you can see here under one method, in one property located in central West Queensland, over 25 years there was only potential to generate 13,500 carbon credits, and basically it was a break even after 25 years. A similar methodology, native forage from managed regrowth, where you've got cleared land and you allowed forest to come back. This was in a higher rainfall area in northern Queensland. We had 125,000 carbon credits over 25 years, and you can see a net income there of just shy of $1 million over 25 years for allowing that forest to return and you permanently sequestering that carbon. So some real contrast there, and I guess the message I wanted to drive home was that you need to do your homework up front to understand what that emission reduction potential is based on the method that might be applied and your particular circumstances. And the final one here is on the next page is the savanna burning method, where we looked at several project areas, hypothetical projects in the Northern Territory Gulf region. We selected 3 properties. You can see the areas that are involved there are significant. These are very large properties in Northern Australia. But again, just the contrast there, you've got one project area which is 15,000 square kilometres, the other which is a little more than half at 8,700, but the smaller area actually has not quite double, but a significantly larger potential for reducing emissions, and that's based on its history of fire and late season wildfires on that particular property. So what you can see there is you've got significantly greater income from Project 2, despite it being smaller. I've stuck an extra 0 on my net income there on Project 2. I apologise for that, but it's just over 2 and just shy of $4 million of net income from those savanna burning projects, which is, again, you're going to get some significant benefits from bringing those wildfires under control, but again, contrast there in the amounts of revenue you might be eligible for. We talked a little bit already about aggregation. Now, the numbers of cattle and the land areas we're talking about in these scenarios are significant. For smaller producers, it may make more sense to go to work with an aggregator, and that is to, at an individual farm level, you may not reduce emissions enough to make it worthwhile participating in an auction and going through the audit and all of those transaction costs involved. But there are aggregators out there, which Steve alluded to earlier, that may perform that role, and they will work with multiple landholders. And really, I guess, the 2 major things that an aggregator should be able to do for you if you're considering it is take care of the technical burden for you, so fill out the paperwork, help you with your record keeping and data collection, and pull all that data together from multiple landholders, and then manage the commercial side of the ERF, that is participating in these ERF auctions, or, as we alluded to earlier, the secondary market, so that if they've got extra carbon credits, they can sell them to somebody else, or if they need to buy extra credits to fulfill on their contract, they can get them from that secondary market. So your aggregators there, particularly for maybe southern producers who have smaller herds, smaller land areas, or for some smaller producers in the north, aggregation is something that's really critical to consider. I'm going to move on to now a bit more of the commercial aspects that we explored during the study. And I've sort of tried to simplify it all down and come up with these 3 potential markets that producers might want to consider. And we've touched on 2 of them already: ERF auctions, the secondary market where you might buy and sell credits outside of those government contracts, and then the voluntary carbon market, which we'll talk about briefly. So the ERF is what I think is the main game. You get long duration, fixed price contracts with a AAA rated counterparty, that is the Australian government. So you get a lot of certainty by, I guess, engaging in an auction and securing a contract for up to 10 years with the government at a guaranteed price. So, as we touched on before, they're fixed volume contracts, so you've got to deliver 100% of the volume that you contracted, but there's some flexibility in the timing of when you deliver that, and also, as I said before, you can make good by buying credits from other projects to fulfill on those delivery obligations. Another challenge there, though, is the timing. So the government spent 25% of its budget at the first auction, and how long will the money last? Well, the government is trying to use the ERF to hit its 2020 emission reduction commitments. So we're already in 2015. It wants to get as many emission reductions happening in the next 5 years. It's not going to be trying to spend money in 2018 in order, it's not going to be wanting to be spending a lot of money in 2, 3, 4 years' time, because none of those emission reductions will occur before 2020. So it's really the main game for the government is to move quickly. The other challenge with the ERF, though, is this transparency. It's, unlike when you're selling your cattle, you know what the market rate is. When you're participating in an auction, that benchmark price is unknown and can change between auctions. So the government holds the cards to a certain extent in terms of understanding what the price might be. The secondary market, as we've just touched on, aggregators and other project proponents that are managing their carbon credit over or under deliveries are really the main driver of this, and we've already seen this kind of market emerge since that first auction in April. So you're seeing project proponents saying, well, I missed out on a contract, does anyone else want to buy my credits? You're seeing project proponents who've got contracts who might say, you know what, I just want a bit of insurance here, I'm going to buy some extra credits just to make sure I can deliver on my contract with the government. So you're already seeing some buying and selling going on outside of that auction process. And as a producer, you might choose to exclusively sell into this market rather than take on a contract, a fixed volume contract with the government. But I guess the challenge is there is knowing where the prices are and how much demand there'll be in the longer term within the secondary market. The final opportunity, I think, is the voluntary carbon market, which many of you will be familiar with, which is where individuals or companies decide, I want to go carbon neutral. It's a very small market, so the annual market we estimate is 1 to 2 million carbon credits, and when you compare that to 47 million tonnes of carbon credits that were contracted at the first ERF auction, you get a sense of the disparity in the scale and therefore the demand for carbon credits there. So really coming out of this study, what my view is that the main game is really participation in ERF auctions, either directly as a counterparty to government or via an aggregated project, and supplementing that with secondary market activity in order to make sure you can deliver on those contracts. In terms of pricing, as I think I had up on the slide previously, whilst the average price paid was $13.95, I'm aware of project proponents who put forward bids at high 15s and $16 and didn't get a contract. So I think it was a pretty tight spread around that $13 to $14 amount. So those who are hoping to get the $20 a tonne certainly missed out. But you can manage your volume exposure so you're not over contracting and use that secondary market there to hedge or sell any excess. So I will finish up there. I've gone a little over time, but keen to take any further questions at this stage.
No, that's fine. Yes, I am conscious of time, but yes, we will take some questions, and there are a lot of questions that have been coming in, so I'm unlikely to get through all of them, but we will try and do our best. Does the cost of managed regrowth include loss of grass production and cattle production as tree basal area increases?
No. So the way we did our monitoring, our estimate of those costs was the direct costs around kind of carbon compliance, if you like. So the costs and benefits that are associated with implementing the project. So if you're doing, as Steve mentioned, a herb management project, that you might be increased beef production, we didn't price that in. And similarly with a forestry project, we didn't say, well, if you're locking up the past, locking up areas, or you're losing pasture, what might be the consequences in terms of beef production on your property. So we had to constrain, just because of the time and level of complexity involved, we constrained our analysis to say, what are the direct carbon expenses? So I've got to pay an auditor, pay some technical specialists to help me out, do my monitoring and reporting on my carbon credits, but then what the sort of spillover effects might be across your business, we didn't assess, but it is absolutely critical for you to consider before going into a carbon project, because some will have major benefits in terms of your underlying beef production system, and some may have negative impacts in terms of your level of production of beef. Just with the example you've given there, Greg, or the person asking the questions given in terms of pasture productivity.
Okay. Another quick question. Can double the carbon credits be generated from production systems such as Lucina pastures that increase soil carbon through sequestration and also lower carbon emissions at the same time?
Short answer is yes. So you can have multiple methodologies running and multiple projects running on the same property, and we're doing quite a bit of work, or we have done under the National Livestock Methane Program, a lot of work looking at Lucina, and obviously it's got its great productivity benefits, which could be quantified under the herb management method, and then likewise the soil carbon benefit could also be picked up if under the current soil carbon and grazing systems method there. So yes, there is an opportunity to run multiple activities in your property and apply different methodologies. So you might have nitrate supplementation, herb management, you might have Lucina growing, doing soil carbon, and you're planting out shelter belts. So you could go to town and have multiple projects and methods running concurrently.
Okay, Conscious of time, one last quick question. As more projects become approved, are we likely to see aggregators become carbon credit traders who make their business profit without actually delivering carbon credits to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
In short, yes. So, and we already saw that in the first auction. So the majority of credits that will be delivered under those projects that were contracted at the first auction will be delivered by intermediaries. So that is specialist groups, so aggregators who are working, or technical service providers working with landholders and others, piggeries and others, to create the projects and deliver those credits to the government. Obviously, there is a sharing of revenue with the landholders, and that's a commercial agreement between the landholders and their service providers. But aggregators are already really active out there in the market, and I think provide an important there's an important role there that they can provide technical assistance, but also provide some, I guess, take on some of the risk of delivering those credits into those contracts. So, whilst landholders who go through an aggregator might have to sacrifice some value, they certainly should, get some value back from that service provider in terms of technical assistance and risk management.